Hello and welcome to the Psychology Is podcast. I am Nick Fortino. This is our 58th episode of the podcast, and today I'm joined by Kent Shultz. Welcome, Kent.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And what we're here to talk about is your story. I think it's of interest to a great many people, and I'll let you tell your story, but I'll share with the audience that Kent and I have been corresponding online quite a bit, and we did have a preliminary conversation where I got many of the details of the story, and so here we are, officially recording the podcast episode where I have some background knowledge about what you've been going through, and I would interpret it as just a story of resilience, a story of really actively seeking support and treatments that would be effective, and having to try many different things in order to find relief and support, but ultimately succeeding in finding supportive things and reaching a point now where you feel much better and are finding yourself able to function much better than you were. And I just think that, you've kind of reached the light at the end of the tunnel that so many people here is really there but can't really see. And so I just think it's very important for people of all types, whether they are professionals or people who can personally relate to what you're about to share, or anyone just interested in psychology. This is kind of a mini case study. So again, I appreciate you being here. I appreciate all the listeners who are present right now. And I'd love to take this journey, listening to you. Give us any background that you would like, that you feel is relevant from your childhood, your upbringing, and then dive deeply into when you would say that your suffering and your struggles with mental health began, and then the journey that ensued from that point.
Sure. Well, thank you for that framing, Nick. And it's a very open framing, which I appreciate. It gives me the freedom to speak from whatever is coming up as most important to me today. I will try and keep this, I guess, kind of chronological to start. But as we explore topics, as topics come up that are of interest to people, that you think will be of interest to people, definitely feel free to, interject and let me know at any time. And we can pick up the chronological thread if that makes sense later on, but I'm happy to go down whatever avenues this conversation leads us down. So, perfect. Yeah. So I'm 38 years old. I'll just start with that, I guess. I did not really have any signs of overt so-called mental illness when I was a kid. I would say, like so many kids, I had what felt to me like maybe an ordinary level of shyness, social awkwardness, melancholy, kind of a serious kid. But, I had friends. I was so-called well-adjusted. I did well in school. I didn't have any major traumas as a kid. I didn't have an early experience of like loss or death, or accidents or anything like that. No big T traumas, as they say these days, that I know of. Did well in high school, went to college, was very motivated, felt pretty motivated in college to get a practical education and have a well-paying job and at least a somewhat prestigious job when I finished school. And those were kind of the things that were important to me. I didn't really have any notion of, but is this my vocation? Is it my calling? What do I really get passionate about? What do I really care about? I was always a good math student as a kid, and math and science. And I liked computers a lot as a teenager. And I decided to study computer science and liked my programming courses. And the tech industry, let's see, so this was after the first .com bust, and kind of tech jobs, the tech industry was kind of coming back up, and it seemed like a very promising career path. And so I did well in school, finished, and started working, and was apparently getting along well and succeed, having success in my career. And I moved away from the Midwest. I'm from Missouri, and I live back in Missouri now. I moved to California and worked there for many years at different companies. I was conscious from early on in my career in IT or in tech that I wasn't just happy to do any kind of programming and work at whatever company sort of gave me the best salary or things like that. It really mattered to me what the mission of the company was, and that I could get behind it. And I really struggled to find. I saw way more companies that I maybe did not think were outright unethical, but just were doing things that I didn't think needed to be done in the world. So early on in my sort of mid-20s, early on in my career, I started having kind of a sensitivity to that. But I was doing well. Eventually I moved out to the San Francisco Bay Area, Silicon Valley, and got a job there with a company that was still the best tech job that I ever had, because I really believed in the company's mission. And I left there after a year because I got an unexpected job offer from Uber to go be a software engineer at Uber. And this was when Uber was a private company still, but they had an enormous valuation for a private company. And so it was attracting a lot of people like me, I'm afraid to say, who had dollar signs in their eyes and just were coming there to get big stock options. And everybody knew they were going to go public in a few years. And that's why I went there. I felt very out of place there. I felt the toxic, the culture pretty immediately I felt was toxic. You couldn't trust your fellow engineers. You didn't know which managers you could trust. It seemed like the leadership liked that there was a lot of intercompetition among even frontline engineers, and then kind of lateral competition among managers too. And projects would come and go, and you'd start working on something, and then a new person would get hired from Google or some prestigious place and say, no, scrap that. We're not doing any of that. We're taking a completely different direction. It's very chaotic. I mean, it was kind of what many people think of as the definition of startup life. And many people thrive in that, and they like that. I did not. To me, it was the pace of things coming and projects coming and then suddenly going away, and who's in charge here, and does anybody know what's going on? To me, was kind of like a distillation of the absurdity that not just tech work, but I would say white collar work in general can often be. It really highlighted that, just like, I don't know that what I'm doing every day is making any difference. I was programming this thing for the last month. Now it's in the trash bin. Like, what am I doing here? And I don't, so the sort of existential melancholy that had maybe already always been in me as a kid really, really was rising. And around this time, I discovered some thinkers and philosophers who began to influence me. And I could not stay till the end of my first year at the company. For those who don't know, in the tech industry, to earn any of your stock options, you have to stay for at least 1 year to vest any of them. And I was just driving myself crazy with anxiety, and I had terrible heartburn, which is something I had struggled with, but it got way, way, way worse. And my acid reducers weren't enough, and I would have this terrible heartburn and all this somatic. I mean, I would not have called it that way at that time. I didn't really know about that, but I just had all this like somatic stuff going on when I would go into meetings at Uber. And I got bad enough. I went to a gastroenterologist and got an endoscopy to make sure I wasn't getting an ulcer. I was not, but I was very unwell mentally, and I was questioning just life. I wasn't sure what meaning kind of first my job held, and then over the years following that. So this was in 2016 that I left Uber. In the years and sort of starting in 2016, following that, I had this creeping sense of like, I'm not sure why my job matters or why I do what I do. Why do I actually, and did I consciously choose this, or am I just, I'm chasing money, but like I know kind of deep down that that's not the most important thing. And it was just a very confusing time. I was in this living in one of the most expensive cities to live in the country, if not the world. Actually, I wasn't living in San Francisco. I lived in Berkeley with my then girlfriend. And she had a well-paying job too. And, I felt like we're here in the Bay Area. We're trying to have a go of it. And the reason to be here is to try and make a lot of money. So maybe I can quit Uber, but then like, I got to find another company that has like a mission that I really care about, and I can't go back to my old one. I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't know where to turn next. And, the idea kind of like psychiatric illness, I kind of started to entertain that idea, and immediately didn't make a lot of sense to me, and never really had. I was not aware at all yet of any of the, although I always had been interested in human nature and psychology, even from my college days, I wasn't aware of any of the what used to be called the anti-psychiatry movement, and now has kind of become the critical psychiatry movement. I wasn't aware of any of the criticisms and arguments of that, but yet I always kind of felt inclined towards that. I felt that if I were to take antidepressants or some other treatment, that was not going to just help me to be happy at a place like Uber or even in the tech industry. So I resisted that for some years. I did not go on psychiatric meds for some years.
It's a quick question.
Sure.
You mentioned that you, I think during this time period, began reading more certain thinkers and philosophers. Mm-hmm. And I remember in our previous conversation, you brought up the work of William James, mm-hmm. and the concept of the sick soul.
Yes.
So I was just wondering if you could kind of share your reflections on first your understanding of that concept and how it kind of maybe how you were able to relate to it.
Definitely. So I heard about, I didn't even hear about William James until maybe 2018. I read about him in the journalist Michael Pollan's book. People may know Michael Pollan from his writing on food and organic food, The Omnivore's Dilemma and Defensive Food. And then he wrote a bombshell book in 2018 about the psychedelic renaissance, so-called, for using psychedelics like LSD and mushrooms for helping mental illness, for curing depression and addiction and things like this, for those who haven't heard of that. But I think it's pretty well out there now.
And for people, just so they know, it's called How to Change Your Mind.
Yes.
That's
the book. Yes. So I had read a few of Pollan's books before. I was not interested in anything to do with psychedelics. To me, when I was that age, let's see, that would have been about 30 when I read that book. I had never done anything like that. I had never done any, drugs as a teenager or anything. And so it's not like that naturally appealed to me. But he was a mainstream figure, a trustworthy, kind of straight-laced, hard-nosed journalist figure who was writing about that. So he referenced William James in the book, and psychedelic advocates often do. There's a famous passage, maybe one of James's most quoted passages, from maybe his most well-known work, his lectures, The Varieties of Religious Experience, which I think were delivered in 1902 and 1903 or thereabouts. And he had one lecture on the mystical experience. And anyway, we can go into that topic in a bit if you like, but since you mentioned the sick soul, I would just say that Michael Pollan's book pointed me to James. I read The Varieties of Religious Experience, and the chapter that really popped for me and grabbed my attention was not the mystical experience chapter, although I would soon thereafter go on to dabble with psychedelics. The chapter or the lecture that popped was the sick soul. He has kind of a pair of lectures, one about the healthy-minded, people who seem to be constitutionally just almost always optimistic and joyful and just seeing the best in life, seeing the best in people and in humanity in general. And the world is just this shimmering, wondrous place to the healthy-minded. And he gives the example, I think, of Walt Whitman. This was one of James's favorite examples across many of his writings and essays for the healthy-minded. And then he writes on the sick soul and spoke and gave a lecture on the sick soul, which he was firmly considered himself to be. In fact, one of the examples that he gives in there, is actually of himself, an experience he had of melancholy, and he kind of cited it as an anonymous example, but scholars would later realize it was his own. But the example from that chapter, from that lecture that stood out to me was the example of Leo Tolstoy. I did not know much about Tolstoy. I never read War and Peace or Anna Karenina. I was not that into literature as a young person, and I would say still not very well read across literature, kind of works of classic literature. But I did read one of his later existential works in college, I think for a writing class. The Death of Ivan Ilyich is a small novella, very existential, and was very influenced. He wrote that after his own existential crisis, a period of despair. Tolstoy, when he was about 50, after he had achieved world fame and had all this land and all his children and a wonderful family and all the success in life that anyone could theoretically want from the outside looking in. And he couldn't put together any reasonable meaning for his life, starting around 50. And so William James cites the example of him going through his crisis. And I went and later read Tolstoy's Confession, where he gives the full account kind of how it went on for years for him, and the spiritual turn that he took in his life, and how he kind of left his old identity behind as a famous artist and intellectual, influential artist. He came to abhor what the circle that he used to keep. He said, we were teaching people, we didn't know what we were teaching them. We were just making stuff up. We would contradict each other. Nobody noticed that it wasn't making sense at time, but we were all making great money. And so he was a great man who had all the material success that one could want. And so I read this in James's lecture and realized, like, you can have it all together, and still things cease to have meaning for you. Now, James is very framing of this as the sick-souled. Perhaps a modern psychologist or psychiatrist who is more oriented towards just a strictly biological model or the materialistic view of human beings as just mere material might view that as kind of antiquated and, it's not, there's spiritual sickness. What do you mean? This is just like a biological thing going on in your brain. Like Tolstoy was just, if he had access to modern psychiatries, what if he had access to those tools and had gone to a psychiatrist, what would they have told him? And
good question. It's a good question.
Go back to what what I was told by so many psychiatrists in my worst year of my life was, well, you probably need to get back to work so you don't have all this free time. And you probably need to do the kind of work that you were trained for. Even though I was constantly telling them I didn't want to do that and believed that feeling like I must do that work for 40 plus hours a week was what was driving me mad. And if Tolstoy had done that and had gone back to just writing kind of wonderful fictional novels, and no matter how many people would have enjoyed them, how much money he would have made, we would not have had his later spiritual works. He would not have inspired Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King and the nonviolence movement of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And so I realized in reading James and some of the other examples in The Sick Soul and examples in his chapter on conversion experiences, that, as he said in, I think, the first lecture to the varieties of religious experience, many religious geniuses go through periods of melancholy in their lives. And that's just the nature of it. And I realized that to be in despair is not, this is tricky how to put this, because psychologists and psychiatrists will not like to hear this. Many of them will not like to hear me saying this to fellow sufferers as I once was. But there's often this idea that to be depressed and despair, and I won't speak on like things like psychosis and other states of high distress or suffering that I don't have experience with. I'm speaking in this podcast mostly just about kind of despair. It's often assumed that is a state of where you are not encountering truth. You are in a deluded state about the nature of the world, about the nature of how much hope you actually have to find meaning in your life and make something good of it. And certainly there are, but I would say I would love to engage with you on this and to hear your thoughts on this too. But like the very existence of it being there, to me, I always felt, from even before I went to Uber, is a rudder, or in some cases at least, in my cases like me, is pointing you towards something. You have something, and you're not living your life in a way that matters to you. You haven't made your own path yet. Maybe you took a job, or maybe married someone, or moved to a city, or made some other major life decision because you're pleasing somebody else in your life. You're trying to keep up appearances for somebody else, but it's not true to you. It's not what makes you feel alive.
It's beautiful. I agree with everything you just said. And I really appreciate you touching on that. And I remember being introduced to the varieties of religious experience when I was doing my psychology schooling. And I remember the chapter on the sick soul as well. And I remember another word for it too that he would use is the morbid minded. But I also remember the key point that the sick souls tend to have greater insight into the human condition, and that they are, by virtue of their suffering, much more motivated to kind of get to the bottom of the nature of human existence. And ultimately, they have to answer the question, why is life worth living? Whereas to the healthy-minded, like you said, the constitutionally happy people, they don't really have to wrestle with that question. It's kind of just evident to them. It doesn't even cross their mind that there needs to be some grand meaning to their lives. But I think it's a very important, personal, existential, philosophical question. Why go on living? Mm-hmm. And then when a person is suffering intensely, when they're in despair, that question is paramount, because it becomes very difficult to go on living. So the reason better be really good. Mm-hmm. So I hear what you're saying about despair, both that it is often framed as you must not be kind of perceiving the world clearly. There must be, like you said, some delusion involved. Mm-hmm. And then also just the nature of despair as pushing you toward gaining clarity and insight on the real meaning of your life, and questioning everything, questioning all of your circumstances, the way you are, the things you do, and whether that is actually authentic to who you believe yourself to be. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, those are my thoughts. I appreciate the framing too, because many people are in despair. And I think this helps them maybe realize that it's not in vain. It's not a pointless thing. It's kind of, it's easy, for example, to see how other unpleasant emotional states have their place, like fear protects us from danger. But it's not as easy to see how something like despair or a deep depression has functionality in our lives. But I think what you've highlighted here is kind of the functionality of despair, depression, and human suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I came to believe that it's something to be listened to and paid attention to. And of course, many of us, spend so much of when we are in kind of having a low level of despair or depression or unsatisfactoriness, or something about our life isn't satisfactory, but we just can't quite put our finger on it. So we just keep plodding along every day as we must. And that is admirable, especially say you have dependents, you have kids, you are doing what you must do to provide for them. And you haven't had the luxury that I had of like being able to step back and really go. And so for the person who doesn't have the time to do that, they just feel that they must keep marching on. And so they will do things like drink alcohol every night, even if it's just only one or two. The government may say that one or two a night is okay, and so like it's fine. Everybody does it, and other in the long run, unhelpful behaviors that prevent people from remembering that they have that kind of low level anxiety or despair, restlessness, confusion there. And I suppose that's a good segue to say that, like, I drank for many years. From college, I got very interested in craft beer. Never really went to the frat parties and drank the cheap domestic beer. I just started with craft beer from the beginning and loved it right away. I mean, I had to spend maybe a month or so acquiring a taste for it. And once I had, I was obsessed with beer. And I began homebrewing in college and continued doing that when I got out of college. I entered some competitions, homebrewing competitions. I ended up winning some awards. I became a certified beer judge at one point. I mean, beer was like my main hobby. I kind of think I knew from like the start of my career, right after college, that like it wasn't the thing I cared most about. Like it was bringing home the money, but I always had this dream of like starting a microbrewery someday. And in my off hours, just beer was like the thing. It was what I cared about. And when I would travel, I mean, it would be all about I got to find the rare beers and the unusual styles that I can't get in my hometown. And I traveled internationally, and tried beer, went to the pubs in England and went to the beer halls in Bavaria, Germany. And it was just a huge part of my life. And I was never at a point where it was obvious to anyone in my life, least of all me, that it was causing any problems for me. I didn't lose any jobs over it. I wasn't, calling in sick to work because I was hungover. And I certainly wasn't, like hitting my girlfriend or shouting at her even. I mean, looking back, I think probably we would get into little bickerings and silly arguments that wouldn't have happened without the drinking. And more than that, I think like it keeps people kind of in the dark about like their inner life. And it just does not, as I experienced it, and so many have, like it does not make you your best, most charitable self. But yet I didn't think I had any kind of problem. And I thought, I love this, and maybe I'll own a craft brewery someday. And then one day this was maybe in 2017, late 2017. So after the kind of existential crisis was like starting to pick up and snowball a little bit, I read this article in the Atlantic entitled The Irrationality of Alcoholics Anonymous. And, being someone who fancied himself as a drinker in control, and also someone who was raised Christian and no longer considered himself Christian, and knowing AA was kind of, a Christian organization, and, I just clicked on it. And I thought it would be amusing to read something critical of AA, And in that article, the journalist mentioned a medication. The whole article was not about it, but she mentioned a medication called naltrexone. She was telling a kind of a narrative of a guy who sounded a lot like me. He was in his 30s and was an attorney, I think, or something, and seemed to be successful, but just was drinking a bit too much, what I kind of call moderate plus. Like, maybe like 3 to 4 drinks most nights, a bit more on the weekends, but you're holding it together, and you seem to be. And she talked about how he had tried naltrexone, this drug that's an opiate blocker, and specifically if you take it according to a little known method called the Sinclair method, whereby you take the pill and don't abstain from drinking, but you take the pill and actually intentionally drink while on it. And that helps deconstruct the reward circuitry in your brain that is the addiction. The idea being nobody starts with an addicted brain. It takes some time. It's a learned behavior. This is the idea behind the Sinclair method, and there have been other psychologists that I've read about who also have this kind of learned behavior model of addiction. Naltrexone helps you unlearn that behavior. You take this opiate blocker, and then when you drink, the endorphin response that normally would light up your opiate receptors is blocked. And over some months, if you always take the pill before you drink, you stop caring. You become about alcohol. You become apathetic to it, and it just is not it's not something that matters in your life anymore. You don't get cravings anymore. You more or less have reached a cure. If to cure is kind of in the lexicon of disease, and by the model of the Sinclair method, it's not technically a disease, and we can talk more about that if you like. It's a topic I love to talk about. But you have reached a state that is called pharmacological extinction, where your reward circuitry is pretty much dismantled. And so I did this at the end of 2017 and into 2018, and it pretty well worked in 4 or 5 months for me. I could not believe it. I thought at the beginning, I don't want to stop drinking entirely. And if this could help me cut my drinking in half, That would be very healthy for me. I would like that. And that's what I had planned for it to do. But it worked so well that in 4 or 5 months, I did not care about drinking anymore. And I had kind of naively hoped that I'm going to be much more well mentally now. Maybe I'll enjoy work again. Maybe I'll get a new job. Maybe I'll start to flourish in other ways. But kind of the opposite happened. As I kind of was saying earlier, like it was covering up the depths of my psyche for years, and or the connection to the soul, if you like. And the crisis around work and meaninglessness kind of got worse. And especially there was also kind of a vacuum hole left in my ego. I started to realize in 2016 that I don't really care about computer programming, and this is not, it had been a part of my identity during school and then during my early career, but like I realized and then I started shifting into the beer thing, and maybe this is kind of who I am, as I know a ton about beer, and I'm an expert judge, and I'm going to have a brewery someday. Well, once the Sinclair method worked so well, that possibility was then gone. But I had this, okay, so I'm not a tech guy and I'm not a beer guy. So like, what am I going after now? Like what matters to me, and how do others perceive me? And I don't know what I'm about anymore. It's very confusing. But I'm afraid that kind of pausing there will make that sound unappealing to people to do that, to take naltrexone and extinguish their cravings for alcohol, because for me it did make things more difficult in the long run, or in the short run. But in the long run, I am so glad that alcohol is out of my life. I do still occasionally drink, but it's not like a person who used to have a problem and then they haven't drunk for 5 years or 10 years, and then they go back, have one night at New Year's, and then they just go wild because it's like, wow, it's like, I forgot how good this feels. If you do the Sinclair method, it's really not like that. Because again, you've undone the reward. Every time you have a beer or a cocktail or something, it kind of is like the first time you ever had one when you were young. Like, you get a bit intoxicated. It might taste good. It might taste kind of whatever, but it's not like, oh, we're back and I'm going to have a dozen drinks tonight or something. Right. So you feel kind of protected. You are supposed to take the pill when you drink every time the rest of your life. And that's kind of the official guidance of those who advocate the Sinclair method. I won't pretend that I'm 100% compliant on that every time, just because of the inconvenience of carrying around a pill for those 3, 4, or 5 times a year that I might have a beer, which is about how often it is now. But I guess I would just say to those who might hear about that and might be curious to ask their doctor or psychiatrist about naltrexone, that you may think now that you cannot imagine your life without alcohol. I understand that. That was absolutely me. I mean, given everything I just said about how obsessed I was with it and how much I made it a part of my identity and my free time and hobby and all of that, I can only tell you that from my vantage now, like, I am so glad that it's out of my life. But for those, there are people I've heard of who it does not eradicate all of their drinking within 4 or 5 months. They may go on for years, still having a few drinks a week, having some drinks every weekend, but it's much more in control than they were before. And you really don't realize until you've been taking it for a few months how little control you actually had before, if you're a drinker like I was, which is, again, I kind of called moderate plus. But anyhow, yeah, what are your questions or reflections on that?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. And I mean, I'm getting kind of a different perception, I guess, because you did share some of this with me in our first conversation, and yet what I didn't quite realize was how tied drinking was to your sense of self, how tied being a beer guy was to your identity, and how significant it was to lose two pillars of your identity in a very short time period, being the tech guy and the beer guy, like you said. And just how, and then on top of that, removal of that kind of important feature of your identity was, I'm sure, some degree of an exposing of whatever beer was hiding. Like you said, your I forget exactly how you put it, but your inner world probably became much more illuminated and clear to see once the cloud of alcohol had been removed. So that seems like a very significant part of your journey. And I do appreciate you sharing like the method, because of course, as we know, countless people struggle with alcohol, and I appreciate your message to those people too, because I think that is exactly what many people need to hear, is it's literally impossible for them to imagine their life without alcohol. It's woven in completely. So it's great to hear someone from your perspective for whom alcohol was completely woven into your life. And here you are from a totally different vantage point. Okay, without it, functioning without it. Yeah. So this, just to get the chronological timeline in place in my head, this process of taking naltrexone and that few months of kind of eradicating your craving for alcohol was around 2017.
Yeah, I started it in late 2017, and I think I probably reached pharmacological extinction by April or May or June of 2018.
Okay.
Yeah.
And at this point, you're still living in California.
Correct.
And you're beginning to feel an intensification of your struggles internally.
Yes.
And where does it go from here?
Well, let me think here. I guess I would also say that there was some loss in my family right around the time I was going through the quitting drinking or tapering down, and it was both of my remaining grandparents and then the adopted son of my sister, 13-year-old son she had, died of leukemia. They were all three within just a few months of each other, and I don't know how much that amplified my mental distress, my emotional distress. But I guess I will just flag that was happening during that time. Mm-hmm. And by this point, I was kind of irregular with work. I was still accepting certain jobs in the tech industry. My then girlfriend was she was not pressuring me to like, well, why aren't you working? You know, like if I was out of work for a couple months, she was like, we had enough margin, and she knew I was trying to get better, and she was very supportive. So I was lucky to not be in the position of having to rush back into any job, just any tech job that I knew would make me unhappy. I was still in the process of trying to tell myself that if I just find the right company with a mission that I can really care about and a great culture, and I love the founders are awesome, and they might have this like toxic masculine kind of energy that many tech companies like the one I was at in 2016 have or had. I don't know how it is today at Uber, but I was still hunting around, and I had one job in 2018, and I think I held it for 4 or 5 months. And I remember when I quit, I kind of gave looking after my mental health as the reason that I needed to leave, and didn't want to burn any bridges. And I went on meditation retreat right after that. It was the second or third silent meditation retreat I had been on. I felt guilty after every job that I quit. I just remember feeling so many times through those years, why do I think I'm so special that I have to find just the perfect thing. And I'm not willing to work for years and years. And it's just this kind of job that, why is it not good enough for me like it is for everybody else, that the job is well paying and is in a nice office and they have free food in there and some of your coworkers are pleasant and you live in this great fun city and you have enough money, and why is that not good enough for me? I just felt guilty every time I would quit a job, and it felt like after every time I would quit, and I was never fired. I just quit. I just kept quitting. It must have been not long after I quit that job in 2018 so again, I had read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, and he was careful to say in the book and on his book tour, the podcast tour that he did that year, like, I'm not saying everybody go out there and do this. I'm not Timothy Leary in the 60s going, everybody turn on, like drop acid and like turn on. Like I'm not trying to turn on the whole culture. He's like, I'm just telling you my experience and some of the neuroscientific research, and you do with it what you will. And I was like, well, obviously I'm gonna try it. And again, at this point, I had not yet tried any of the official treatments from psychiatry. No medications, nothing like that. And I did not.
So really, you hadn't even met with a psychiatrist at this point. No diagnosis or anything either.
That's correct. No diagnosis. I had seen a few primary care doctors, and I think one had prescribed me Zoloft, and I went out and got the bottle, took it home. Never even took one. I was like, I just knew. I was like, this is dumb. This is not gonna. It might mute some things, but it's like Joanna Moncrief has pointed out on your podcast and elsewhere. Like it's the drug-centered model. It's not functioning that differently from, say, alcohol. Like it's kind of like helping you to get by in your life as it is now. If you're a person, and I want to say I recognize that if you are a person who feels constrained to stay in the marriage, to stay in the job that you're in now, to keep the major parameters of your life as they are, and you have the kids to take care of, or if you don't, you still have, financial needs and other responsibilities, and you really just must continue marching on with the major elements of your life as they are now. Then Zoloft or something like that, I get it. If that's helping you, that's great. But I think I kind of intuitively felt like that, like basically what Joanna Moncrief and others have said. Let's just like this is not that different. It just is going to numb me out a little bit and make me kind of forget that I hate this job in this field so much. And that's not going to help me in the end. Like I'm not going to do that and just try and limp along for 5 more years in the tech industry if taking 3 or 4 psychiatric medications can help me. No, I'm going to uproot this. I'm going to get to the bottom of what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I decided to try LSD and psilocybin. And I think very early on, that first year, 2018, when I started dabbling with psychedelics, I, number one, had kind of naive ideas that, number one, that I can do this alone, that I have no experience with what it's like to be in this state of mind, and the kind of completely non-ordinary. I mean, for someone who's never done that, been in that kind of state, either through psychedelics or some other kind of more naturally mediated mystical experience, to just take the chance of launching into that alone in your apartment with maybe a partner who also has never done that, and tell them like, hey, look after me and make sure I'm not freaking out too much. Like, it's like, it can be very fraught, but I did that a number of times. I don't know how many, 6 or 7 times, maybe over the latter half of 2018. It's not like I was doing it every other day. I had understood from Pollan's book that these are not classically addictive. They in the way that so many other illegal drugs are. You're not going to be doing this every day and just like zoning out and just like dropping all responsibilities and just being kind of in a haze all the time. Like, I had 6 or 7 maybe experiences in the last half of 2018. And so I think I was naive about I can do this without a guide and without, just kind of only knowing about what to expect by reading, by what I've read, which maybe is helpful, but it also can set you to have certain expectations. And I think that was the second thing I was naive about in the beginning, was like 2 or 3 of these experiences, and I'm gonna meet God, or I'm gonna commune with some other spirits of the universe or something, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to realize like what my path is now, and I will just begin to just take committed action towards it. And just a couple of just these revelatory experiences, and I'm gonna get it. And it didn't happen. There were many good glimpses of some feelings I had not felt in a long time, like wonder and gratitude. And sometimes as adults, we can go a long time, maybe for some people, most of their adult life, without experiencing real joy or gratitude. And for people who haven't tried psychedelics, it's not, as Alan Watts said, there really is no comparison between being drunk on bourbon and being high on LSD. It's not just this kind of elation of like a night out drinking. It's very, very different. It's very different. You return to a state of mind, certain emotional states that you forgot were even possible for a human, that you may not have felt since you were 4 or 5 years old. And it's a very transient experience, of course. And if you're lucky, some of that gratitude and you feel more connected to people. You feel curious about people. If you're a misanthropic type of person who kind of walks around just feeling like, everybody's an idiot except for me, and it's like, it'll shake that out of you pretty, hopefully, as it did for me often. And so there were some of these positive experiences, but I never seemed to get the really lasting, like, okay, now I know what I'm supposed to do. And I have the energy and the motivation, and I know I'm to go do it. So I continued trying it, and eventually realized that I would like to try it with a guide. I felt I was not able to let go by myself at home or with my girlfriend there. Felt I'm not able to let go. I need to just, if I can be in a safe place where I know is secure, and I'm with very experienced clinicians who I just absolutely trust them, that they know how to handle me physically and emotionally in this state, then I will feel so much more relaxed, and I'll be able to really just open myself to let the experience be whatever it is, and just trust that I will come back in one piece psychologically, and because they're keeping me safe, and not that they can control what direction the trip goes, but I just thought I need to find a guide. And the only, there are underground guides out there, but I didn't know anybody. I was plugged into the psychedelic community. So the only legal psychedelic therapy was ketamine. And being in the San Francisco Bay Area, it was not too difficult to find a ketamine provider. And so I tried that at the end of 2019 and into 2020, and again was not making great progress. I had some glimpses. It didn't feel as, the experiences were not as, they didn't feel as deep and as profound as LSD and mushrooms. They felt a little more abstract and just kind of head trips, like a lot of a lot of confused, just a lot of conflicting, and just all the ideas of the world, all the things I'd ever read, all the things they were often very chaotic mentally, not really bad trips, not like high state of fear, but they just never seemed to really resolve. And eventually I gave up on them when I did have one right around the start of the pandemic. And I think April 2020, that was, I would not classify it as a bad trip, but it was pretty uncomfortable physically. And I felt my heart racing, and I did feel kind of scared. It was done at home. Some providers will give you lozenges to take it home. And even now there's telemedicine kind of providers that maybe you're aware of, Nick, and maybe some of the listeners know about that too. The first few times I did it, I was in the psychiatrist's office, but tried it intravenous and intramuscular. But once he was comfortable that I knew how to handle myself in that state, then I got lozenges at home. And in one of those last lozenge sessions, I just was like, I got very frustrated. It stirred up all this kind of like weird tension and anxiety in my body that never seemed to resolve. It just seemed to stick around. And I got fed up with psychedelics and with ketamine, and I came home to Missouri. I had some talk with my parents one night. This was probably in May or June 2020. And maybe the suicidal thoughts were starting to float up a little more prominent for kind of the first time. They really hadn't been there in the earlier years. I mean, I was like pretty unmotivated and doubtful and confused about what to do in my life, but I wasn't thinking about suicide. But it was starting a little bit. And my parents, I think, realized that, and they asked me if I would like to come home to Missouri and allow them to, I kind of opened up with them about some things I had tried. And they invited me to come home to Missouri and stay with them for a few months and maybe try some more traditional treatments. Now, as everyone knows, most of the psychiatric meds take quite some time to begin working if they're going to work. The first thing that I tried when I got home was there was a psychiatrist in my town whose main offering was transcranial magnetic stimulation. Oh, I should say that right before I went to go try that, I had been put on a few medications by my ketamine doctor from California. It was after my last kind of difficult ketamine experience. I was very anxious for a few nights and could not sleep very well. And then that kind of caused like my mental health to decline, even like slight thoughts of paranoia about different things. It's something I never really experienced before. And, he was worried when he heard that. And he put me on, I think, Wellbutrin and Zyprexa. Now, I had never known or read anything about antipsychotics or psychosis pills, as Peter Gutschke prefers to call them, which I like and appreciate. His whole policy of calling drugs what they are, or not calling them by their usual names. But I didn't ask any questions. I was just desperate to get some sleep for a few nights. And he was just like, take this thing called Zyprexa and you will sleep. And just don't worry. And the idea, of course, was this is going to be short term, like just maybe a week or two, and then my sleep will be normal. And then but once I was on it, I was just kind of like, just keep taking it. And I needed it. I felt like I needed it to sleep. And I normally would be the kind of person to do a lot of my own research before taking any pill like that. But I just was so desperate, and it did help me sleep that first night and the second night. And so I just kept taking it. And so when I came home to Springfield, to Missouri, I was on Wellbutrin and Zyprexa for a few months. I'd been on them for a few months, I would say. Don't think I was on anything else yet at that point. Although,
can I ask really quick, did that psychiatrist diagnose you with anything at that point?
Not that I recall.
Okay.
Not that I recall. I could. He may have, but he was a. I mean, as you might imagine, offering ketamine. Yeah, this was 2018. This was like before it had picked up as it has in the recent years. he was not as much of a mainstream kind of psychiatrist, so maybe he was not as driven by. And I was paying. I mean, the real reason probably is that I was paying out of pocket. Um, you know, so I don't think he needed a diagnosis, right? For insurance coverage purposes,
Right.
people understand how that works.
Right.
That's often what they're for the reimbursement. But when I got to see the psychiatrist in Missouri, I was already on those 2 medications. I did some neuropsych testing with them. I'm trying to remember the first diagnosis that he gave me. It was probably major depression, and that's what I assumed would be the diagnosis. What I felt most accurately captured it. Although plenty of I know that by the DSM, you don't have to have, so what is it, like 5 of 9 or something you have to have. It's kind of arbitrary like that, as so much the DSM is. And there were plenty I didn't have. And a lot of my support system didn't think that I had major depression because I was not sleeping or being in bed for 18 hours a day. And I was able to shower myself, and I was able to go on walks around, and I was not in some kind of half catatonic state, and my appetite seemed more or less normal. And, so I didn't have many of the classic signs of so-called major depression, but
I actually have the DSM-5 pulled up on my other computer here, which is what I'm looking at. And I do want to just read some of the criteria, because I do want to highlight what you're going to share that you've already shared with me, which is which other diagnoses you had been given. And I want to just give people a sense of what the criteria are for these different diagnoses, because it's quite striking to me that you were diagnosed with a variety of conditions that you ended up being diagnosed with, and then were prescribed a variety of drugs. And I know I'm getting ahead of the story a little bit, but that's why I want to read some of the criteria. But before I do, let me just ask you to elaborate a bit on how you would characterize your suffering in this time period. You haven't said too much about what it felt like to go through what you were going through at that phase.
Yeah.
Speak to that.
Well, I don't think at that point in the midsummer 2020, I don't think the daily kind of crying was really a thing yet. Actually, I remember crying many days in the psychiatrist's office when I was going in for transcript for TMS. I just felt that I did not care about anything. Not in like a really negative way, like everything sucks, and not in a real nihilistic, like angry way, like the world is messed up and humanity is fallen, human nature is broken, humans are evil. It's nothing like that. I just couldn't. I had been through with some psychotherapists already, and some who had practiced. I think at this point I'd been with some psychotherapists who practiced like acceptance commitment therapy, which is all around orienting around what are your values. Like you need to align your actions, your daily actions, with what your actual values are. And it was so frustrating to me that I didn't seem to know what my values were. I mean, I kind of could remember what they had been at different times, but when I would say them to myself or to a therapist, it just didn't seem to have any resonance. I just felt like I was just kind of parodying what some part of me felt like I was supposed to say. Whether it's, being physically active and having a healthy diet and being family time, being around family, loving my friends, and doing things for them. But it's like none of it had any resonance to me. I it had this kind of deadness, this really cold deadness. And it was punctuated by these moments where I recognized that, like, I didn't know how to start looking for a job, or like what kind of job I would even be able to do, because like I couldn't care about anything. It was just apathy, and just, it was not really nihilistic, but there was also some somatic stuff still going on that would often come up on meditation retreat, as it does. In particular, in my chest, there was this really constrictive feeling that I came to call kind of like the poison. Like, it felt like it was just this really general malaise all through my trunk, that it wasn't like clenched in the heart where you felt like you're going to have a heart attack or something. It was something more like you just felt like there was something draining life force out of you. Like there's just poison going through your veins. And it would come and go. And when it was there, I mean, I would try and meditate. And sometimes during that time, I would spend 2 or 3 hours a day meditating. And as I mentioned on meditation retreats, I mean, longer than that, but it never seemed to fully resolve. It would come and go. So there was that somatic element going on. It was all very compounded, I would say, and I don't. By feeling so misunderstood by everyone, really by everybody in my whole life. You know, just a feeling of utter isolation. You know, and I felt like, certainly my family at the least were, you know, they had my best interests at heart. I always believed that, but they just still were not able to understand, and maybe nobody really can. Nobody's going through that. It's extremely challenging to be with somebody in that level of apathy and just feeling so bereft. And I just don't know what to do next. Nothing seems to matter. And I guess anxiety, kind of more high states of anxiety with racing thoughts would be happening sometimes. But when I think about those times, that was, I experienced that mostly when I would try to taper off of certain medications, mainly antipsychotics. I don't remember having that kind of highly anxious racing thoughts thing going on, except a few days right before I was put on Zyprexa, and that's why I was put on that.
Right. Which is very noteworthy. I mean, I know that, like, Peter Gutche makes this point a lot, as does Joanna Moncrief, as do many of the critics of psychiatry, many of whom are themselves psychiatrists. And another person who makes this point a lot is Peter Breggin, who say that so often people are prescribed these medications, these drugs, they're put on them for a long time, and then when they attempt to taper off, they begin to feel this anxiety, which are truly withdrawal effects. And if you talk to anyone who uses street drugs, they'll tell you all about withdrawal effects and how intense the craving becomes and how destabilizing it is, really, to stop taking a drug that you've been taking every day. But when we think of coming off of prescribed drugs, it's almost always framed as you sort of relapsing into your condition. And that is a very... it's a way I think that the public is misled. And it's something that it's very interesting to me, because I think people who get addicted to street drugs end up gleaning a lot of wisdom about the nature of drugs that could be, and they have a lot to offer people who are coming off of prescribed drugs, because as we know, much of our audience understands that And I remember you put it this way in our last conversation, that the line between prescribed drugs and illegal drugs is pretty illusory. And there are some important distinctions, like that legal drugs are regulated and therefore they're not cut with fentanyl or mystery ingredients, and that the dose is always very measured and everything like that. But as far as the nature of the sort of active ingredients and the mechanism of the drug, there is no real line between the legal and the illegal. And therefore, the process of coming off of them is going to look the same. And so anyway, I just felt like it was worth really kind of highlighting what you just said. Every time you would come off, you would experience this anxiety. I think many people can relate to that. And many people are told, see, the drug was working. Look, you tried to come off and look what happened. But this is an iatrogenic effect. This is drug induced process.
Yeah. And you're often made to feel like foolish and irresponsible. Like, see, you're not complying. You went off your drugs, and this happens every time. So it happens because you have this condition that you're not believing us that you have.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very frustrating. And they're not, and they don't offer to help you taper off, because that's usually,
right.
For many, there are a handful of niche psychiatrists out there, I'm sure, who do that, but. And maybe that's a lot of their practice, is helping people do the gradual taper that you've talked about and your guests have talked about so much. It was just horrible. Every time I tried to stop Zyprexa many times, and I thought I was doing I would try tapering off over a couple of months, and kind of go down to that by like maybe 25% at a time, and it did not go well any of those times. Pacing around my parents' house. I think one time my dad commented, like, he's like, you're pacing around like a caged animal, like a zoo that's just pacing around. And it's just, and it was horrible trying to come off of it. And then as soon as I go back on it, it's like, okay, it's the anxiety's gone, but now I'm just back into just this kind of existential void that I guess is more tolerable on a day-to-day basis.
But everyone, not to cut your flow of thought off, but just to kind of put a final point on this note, when a person, let's say, attempts to come off of like methamphetamine or heroin or something, and they're struggling, and they're pacing, or they're going through like withdrawal symptoms, and then they end up relapsing, as we call it, and they start using again. No one perceives that as a good thing, that they went back to using. But the perception of when someone starts taking Zyprexa again and they're back to a sort of normal, the perception is, okay, good. We've restabilized you. You're back on your medicine. So again, it's just, the perception of the American public, and in so many cultures really, has been manipulated in this way, and it's just not an accurate understanding of what's really happening. And it's really I would go as far to say a crime against humanity, to make people believe that, like you said, like to make people feel foolish for coming off of these drugs, to make them think that when they then go back on them and aren't overwhelmed with anxiety or aren't experiencing withdrawals, that they've restored their health or something. They've restored their chemical balance. That's a manipulated perception, and it's not okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
So
thank you for putting it that way, pointing that out. Yeah.
So please continue. I thank you for like filling in the detail on like the subjective experience of the distress, the despair, the depression. And so now chronologically, we're in like 2020. You're living in Missouri again.
I think this is a time to say that to speak about my next diagnosis, and to me was the diagnosis that became the most problematic for me. That was one day I was seeing my outpatient psychiatrist, and don't remember why he had this impression. It wasn't as a result of my testing, at least at first. It was just a hunch that he had hearing me speak. And he said, have you ever thought that you might have OCD? And I was confused. I was like, but I don't have any behavioral compulsion. I didn't know much about OCD. And I don't wash my hands for hours a day. I don't turn off light switches, and I don't do repetitive behaviors for hours. Like, what do you mean? And he said, well, it can also be totally mental. It's kind of a pure O, as some call it. And some psychologists don't like that phrase. They feel it's some kind of a misnomer, but I was open to the idea. I think when he said it, I was a little perplexed, but I was open to it because I was wanting an answer. And this is something that the patient, so to speak, as well as their family members and other support people, friends, close friends, they desperately want to get an answer. They want to confirm, like, okay, this is an authority figure who's been treating people for decades, and they know what is your condition, and then they're going to give you the prescribed. So at this point, I was still fairly trusting of him, and I was willing to entertain it. And I don't remember if I did the testing to confirm that, but I may have. I know I did testing with him. But he put me on, within a few weeks or so of me appearing to accept the diagnosis, he put me on the gold standard medication for OCD, which is an SSRI called Luvox. And over a few months, we worked me up to the maximum dosage. And I didn't feel any different really on it. I can't say it gave me a lot of negative consequences, side effects as they're called. At least not that I noticed at first. I later realized it was causing probably maybe not the most extreme or troubling, but one of the most notorious side effects of SSRI is sexual dysfunction. It definitely caused that. But I can't say I felt that different mentally or emotionally. It just kind of felt like no effect.
And just to clarify too, he didn't take you off of Zyprexa and Wellbutrin. It was just an additional.
It was additional. He knew that I had tried to come off of Zyprexa myself, a handful of times, and that had gone very badly. So he was like, okay, well, I guess just, staying. There was no discussion of like, well, maybe we can do a slow taper. It was just, okay, stay on it. Around this time was when I started voicing, like, I sometimes have suicidal thoughts. It wasn't like preoccupying me all the time. And it certainly wasn't to the level of like an intent or planning. But once I said that, he put me on lithium because he said, oh, that can sometimes help with suicidal thoughts. As if suicidal thoughts are just their own niche category of symptom.
Right.
Specific drug is targeting. That seemed very weird to me. And I didn't really buy it, but I just went on it. I went on lithium. I had not yet gotten the diagnosis of bipolar. That would come later in inpatient psychiatry. But this OCD diagnosis really stuck with my family. They strongly believed that it was because to them, I did not have the classic presentation of major depression. So they thought, oh, this is it. And I started seeing an OCD therapist at a clinic that specialized in almost exclusively treating OCD, or at least that particular therapist. But they had a whole team that was trained in OCD and exposure and response prevention therapy. And I did all these things called like imaginal exposures, where you record your voice talking about your fears. And the idea is, so for people who don't, I'm sure you know, Nick, but for people who don't know kind of the different, there's many kind of subtypes, right, of OCD that psychiatrists talk about. And in the realm of the non-behavioral ones where you don't have behavioral compulsion, one of the more apparently common ones, or at least talked about ones, is harm OCD, which is where you become obsessed. You have these repeating thoughts that, like, what if I just become impulsive someday? I'm standing in the kitchen and there's a kitchen knife there on the counter and my wife or my friend is standing there. What if I just like lose control and just pick up the knife and stab her to death? And then you become preoccupied with these thoughts and they loop. And then you have other thoughts that are kind of meant to calm them down and you just get stuck in this cycle. Well, everybody thought that I had self-harm OCD, that I was obsessed, preoccupied every day with the fear that I might impulsively kill myself. Just in a moment of no inhibition. And right away, that did not strike me at all as what was going on in my mind. But I had everybody around me kind of telling me like, we think that's what you have. And it felt very validating at times. And I want to just say again, I don't think anyone was trying to make me feel like I'm going mad by telling me that things were going on in my head that really weren't. But this was and my clinicians too, they would, it's like once everybody got it in their head that I had OCD, like my clinicians in particular, it felt like it framed everything that I said, that it was a lens through everything that I said. So I learned in my therapy that, people with OCD have a kind of obsessive need to have certainty in life about just about everything. They just cannot. It's a kind of anxiety of, it's a kind of syndrome or condition of generalized anxiety about you just need to have, you don't know with certainty that you're not gonna kill yourself in 3 years by randomly steering your car into a light pole, or, people in your life dying, or other tragedies. You just need, a person with OCD is this person just needs certainty, and they're not unable to accept uncertainty, the inherent uncertainties of life, like a well-adjusted person is. And I never felt like that was me, at least not on any kind of generalized level, but I would say certain things and my therapist would kind of gently, she was not too condescending and I had a good rapport with her, but she would kind of, try and like shift me back and be like, remember, we can't have certainty in life, It actually did feel kind of condescending to me at times, a little alienating. And I'm like, but I don't think that's what you're saying right now is reflecting the problem I'm having. So
it's kind of in keeping with the theme of being misunderstood.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing more clearly now how long that was drawn out.
It was.
And maybe,
yeah.
Sounds like it almost got worse because not only did they misunderstand, but they thought they understood when they didn't understand.
Right. And I would continually tell them that I don't feel that this is really my condition anymore. But then I think I would probably have days where I wanted it to be, and I was a little more open to it. And so maybe it appeared as incoherent or just like I couldn't decide what I was trying to kind of go along with him certain days, and like I said, I did have a good rapport with my OCD therapist. I liked her kind of on just like a personal level, and I mostly was enjoying my therapy sessions with her, but eventually it ended up that I went to, well, that would be skipping ahead. And then we've been going on for some time now. I still have yet to talk about my inpatient.
I do want to hear about that. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can go there in a second. I'm tracking, the diagnoses and the prescriptions. And so what you've mentioned so far, as far as the diagnoses, are major depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, and then you briefly mentioned that eventually came bipolar 2.
Yes.
Um, so maybe as my first question right now, when did the bipolar 2 come? So here you are, having been diagnosed with OCD, harm OCD in particular, self-harm OCD in particular, never quite feeling like that fit your inner experience. And so when did the bipolar 2 come?
That was when I went to inpatient psych,
Okay.
which I think was in the summer of 2021.
So if I may, right before you elaborate on that experience, I always think it's important for people to understand just how subjectively these diagnoses are made. There's subjectivity at every level. There's subjectivity in the language of the DSM. There's subjectivity in the process of kind of voting in new disorders for every new edition of the DSM. There's subjectivity in the psychiatrist or psychologist who also diagnose in their interpretation of the client or patients. And there's subjectivity in the client or patient's own interpretation of their experience, in their own self-reporting of the symptoms. And so that's, I think that the many, many layers of subjectivity, as well as the nature of the DSM, can accounts for why a person can have so many different diagnoses. And I just want to give our audience a sense of these conditions. So I have 3 of them pulled up, and I know that there's a 4th one to come. But I'll read the criteria for major depressive disorder for anyone who's interested. So the diagnostic criteria are 5 or more of the following symptoms have been present during the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. And at least one of the symptoms is either depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure. And so then they list 9 possible criteria. And if a person checks 5 of these boxes, they can be diagnosed. The first is depressed mood, most of the day, nearly every day, or that can be observed by others. The second is markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities. The third is significant weight loss or weight gain. The fourth is insomnia or hypersomnia. So in other words, changes in weight, changes in sleep patterns. The fifth is psychomotor agitation or retardation nearly every day. The sixth is fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. Seventh is feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt. The eighth is diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness nearly every day. And the ninth is recurrent thoughts of death, not just fear of dying, but recurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan or a suicide attempt. So that's a wide range of possible symptoms, and this, I think, helps people understand when they see the wide range of symptoms that a person could possibly meet. I think it helps people understand that everyone who has this diagnosis, there's a lot more diversity within that group than people tend to think. And because the criteria are so broad, it makes it so that there's a lot of heterogeneity among people with the same diagnosis. And because there's so much heterogeneity among people with the same diagnosis, it basically makes it impossible to ever really find a treatment that would work for everyone with the same diagnosis, because they all present a bit or significantly differently. So just wanted to make that point. And then I won't spend the time to read, I'll skip the bipolar 2 criteria, but I will read the obsessive compulsive disorder criteria, just to give people a sense again of how surprising it might be that one person could be diagnosed with these 2 different conditions in the same time period. So this OCD is the presence of obsessions, compulsions, or both. And obsessions are defined by recurrent and persistent thoughts, urges, or images that are experienced at some time during the disturbance as intrusive and unwanted. The second aspect of obsessions is that the individual attempts to ignore or suppress such thoughts, urges, or images, or to neutralize them with some other thoughts. Okay. And then compulsions are defined by repetitive behaviors that the individual feels driven to perform in response to an obsession. And the second feature of compulsions is that the behaviors or mental acts are aimed at preventing or reducing anxiety or distress, etc. So there's more to it. I encourage people to read it for themselves. You can access the DSM, or many websites list the whole criteria. But I just wanted to say that because when I hear these two sets of criteria, there's already a wide range of symptoms within each diagnosis. But when then you compare the two, it's very difficult to understand how one person in the same time period, going through the same bout of suffering, could be diagnosed with two conditions that are so distinctly different from each other.
Mm-hmm.
So just wanted to add that into this, but I would love for you to now share any reflections on that if you want, and then continue on with what happens next in your story.
Mm-hmm. Then, yeah, as I said earlier, many of the classic kind of depressive, signs were absent in me, and so, I guess that just left the people in my life, namely the clinicians, but family members too, to just, once my psychiatrist had said OCD, they just kind of thought, well, it's not depression, so this is the next. They just kind of, everybody just kind of like coalesced around it. And it's like, I was not doing any behaviors that were compulsive. So it left everybody just to speculate on this kind of subjective, like what must be going on in my mind. And, when you mentioned before you were reading those definitions in DSM, you were mentioning kind of the subjectivity of these categories. And it reminded me of one psychologist that I consulted with. I never really saw him on an ongoing basis, but I may have mentioned this the first time you and I chatted, but I'm glad it bubbled up when you mentioned the subjectivity of all of this. It reminded me of like the feedback loop that can be going on between a clinician and the patient or client sometimes. And I felt this happened. I had this critical moment where everybody became convinced that I had OCD. I actually spoke with two kind of psychologists who were kind of OCD experts, really well regarded among OCD circles. And I had private consultations with them to get their, 45 minute or 60-minute conversation, whether they thought I had OCD. Now, I had already been told that I might have it, and I had done a lot of reading and trying to understand what characterizes it. And mind you, I have in the back of my mind that like, I want some answers here. I need to, like I was saying earlier, the client or patient is often, you don't want to just have some vague thing that's just like, you want a plan of action, and you want to know that you are presenting as other people have presented, and you can. So what I'm trying to say is I think I went into those two consultations kind of like giving the answers to confirm my diagnosis a little bit. And those two experts both were like, yeah, it sounds like you have OCD for sure. Like they were very, very certain. Like they sounded like, and they were very experienced, many, many years of experience. And one of the consultations I even recorded so that I could watch it later, and that so other people on my support team could watch it too. And once everybody kind of saw that, it was like, okay, this is the thing. Like you need to like really pursue the OCD treatment. So we'll come back to that, more about that later, perhaps, the OCD, because after I stopped going to this outpatient clinic, which was remotely done during COVID, after that, I went back to California. I seemed to have a period of a few months where I was a bit better. I wasn't crying. I wasn't waking up having the first thought of the day be like, there's no hope for my life. I think I'm eventually going to kill myself. Like that didn't seem to go away. And so everyone thought the OCD treatment, the ERP therapy had worked. Meanwhile, I'm still on all the same medications. I don't know if I had changed certain ones or added. I was, so we'll table that for now. But I went back to California, and I don't want to go into this part too much, just out of, I guess, kind of respect for the privacy of my ex-girlfriend, maybe. And even though it is definitely a critical part of the journey, but I went back to California for a month or two. And of course, I'd been in touch with her, and she had visited and all this in Missouri, and was supportive as she could be from halfway across the country. And I went back, and in a few months, I started to take another job in the tech industry, and I quit it within a couple of weeks. Like, I just sat down, and instead of feeling extremely depressed or suicidal, I would sit there, and it's like my whole mind would just come to a stop, and not in like a really peaceful Zen kind of way. Like, I remember the first week on that job, and I would just stare at my computer all day and literally just could not do anything. Couldn't even think about what I was supposed to be doing. And this is a field that I was like trained in, and had years of experience in. So it's not like I didn't know or should not have known what I was supposed to be doing. And I quit again. And I guess I'll just say that within a month or two, I decided to break up with her. And that was extremely difficult for both of us. And even for me, of course, too, even though I was the one who did the breaking up with. And she left for about a week. We lived together, and she left for about a week so that I could gather some belongings and just kind of leave. I didn't know where to go next. I knew I loved living in California. I loved many things about it, but I, for some years, had wanted to maybe get away from it. I missed my family a lot. I was only seeing them a time or two per year for the decade or so that I lived in California, and I was feeling very distant from my family, and I missed them. And so when I broke up with her, whatever wellness I had gotten over the previous few months just crumbled. The reason that I became convinced that I wanted to spend an extended period of time in Buddhist monasteries. And I had done some research on many, and I had been influenced by and had listened to a couple of Buddhist monks through the last few years before that. And I had visited my favorite monk's monastery right before COVID, right around the time I was trying ketamine for the first time. And I felt that I needed to explore that possibility of living in a contemplative, insulated contemplative community for an indefinite period of time. And I think my girlfriend was trying to be understanding of that, but it was still very hard for both of us. We were together for 8 years. And so she left for a week, and my dad came out to help me gather some belongings. He knew I would be in just a pretty tough emotional state, and he flew out, and then we drove my car home together to Missouri with some pretty limited belongings, and I cried all the way home, and I didn't know what the plan was going to be when I got to Missouri. I didn't feel I didn't know that me breaking up with her was going to cause my emotional health to just absolutely crumble like that right away. I just thought, well, I'm going to leave, and then I'm going to go. I had planned out all the monasteries I wanted to visit, and I had been in touch with a few of them, and it was what I wanted to do. And I got home to Missouri, and I just was in an even worse place than I ever was before. And within a month or two, so like June 2021, the suicidal thoughts were getting intense. I didn't think that I was going to take action on anything, but it was just miserable. Like I was spending a lot of the day in bed, but not because I was trying to sleep. I would just lie in bed and cry a lot of the day, pretty much every day. And I couldn't really do anything because it just didn't stop. It was almost like sun up to sundown. There would have periods, a few hours where it would stop, and eventually I just knew I had to interrupt that somehow. And nobody knew what to do with me, and I didn't know what to do with myself. So I told my parents I wanted to go inpatient, and they actually were not recommending that. But eventually I did that. I went in voluntarily, and I think I felt a sense of relief. It's just that my environment had changed, and at least I'm not in that house where I'd spent so many hours crying and just steeping in a swirl of suicidal thoughts. And I saw the psychiatrist. He gave me a pretty long intake. And then, of course, every day after that, I would only see him for, 5-10 minutes. But I knew during my intake with him that I had a pretty limited time. I mean, limited given how much I felt I had to say and catch him up on. Mm-hmm. And so I spoke pretty quickly, probably, and I'm afraid that I must have come off as manic or something. I don't know, but he patiently waited for me to finish, and he pretty quickly just said, you have bipolar 2, you have a mood disorder, it sounds like, and it sounds like bipolar 2. And I was confused. I didn't know much about bipolar. I was like, I don't think I'm manic. I don't have impulsive behavior. I don't go spend incredible amounts of money or gamble or go out and seek a lot of random sex or any of the things that we kind of stereotypically think of as bipolar or manic behavior. And he said, well, that's more like bipolar 1, but bipolar 2 has this thing called hypomania, and it's like a lower level mania. And he told me about that, and I was like, I don't think that even sounds like me either, really. But it seemed to be the pretext for him to put me on a whole host of medications, including what seemed to be his favorite medication, which is another antipsychotic called Invega. Now, I didn't know, I still had not read up a ton on all the different antipsychotics and their different profiles, and I was a little confused why I kept getting prescribed antipsychotics but never had been diagnosed with like schizophrenia or some other kind of psychotic condition. And I only later realized that like they're prescribed for depression and bipolar these days. And it's like, so it was an injectable. And I remember when he described Invega to me, he made it sound very appealing. And it sounded very good to me. I liked hearing it. He said it would make me feel collected and galvanized to take action in my life and well edited. I'm curious, what do you think of that description of
honestly, my initial impression is it sounds like a sales pitch.
Yeah.
It sounds like someone's just selling you on a product.
Yeah.
And and even if like certainly drugs induce certain effects, which might be described like that, especially the galvanization of an individual if it's a stimulant, although this is an antipsychotic, which tends to be more of a tranquilizer, but still that's I'm not very well educated on in Vega itself and the mechanisms of action and the well-known effects long term. But that's my initial thought, honestly, is it sounds great. It sounds like possibly something that was told to him by a pharmaceutical sales representative potentially, or that he heard at a conference that he was funded to attend or something like that, or maybe it came from a more genuine place of experience and witnessing people. Um, but again, the question always is too, if sure there are benefits like those initially, but as time goes on, things change. Our tolerance increases, the costs begin to outweigh the benefits. But anyway, I would just say if I were you, I would have felt the same way you did. How enticing that sounds. Like anyone who hears those descriptions, it's like, yes, sign me up for whatever that is. We all want to feel like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So
needless to say, you were injected with this.
yes.
And admitted.
Yes, I was admitted, yeah. And I was put on a whole host of other things. He upped my Wellbutrin to a pretty high level that I think maybe it was overstimulated me, and I got extremely poor sleep the first couple of nights. Really, most of the nights I was there. I ended up being there 9 days, which is longer than their average visit, the average patient visit there on that unit. But I was put on a couple of mood stabilizers. I was put on also Seroquel, another antipsychotic, to help with the poor sleep that even in the midst of my stay I felt was because of too much Wellbutrin. But the Seroquel seemed to help me sleep. It was a very mixed experience, I would say, on the unit. There were some staff that listened to me very compassionately, and some nurses and a psychologist I really liked as well, who would host group psychotherapy and individual with me, with patients who wanted, were willing, and who the psychologist felt could benefit from it.
Yes.
So I had that, and developed a pretty good rapport with one of the two psychologists in my daily sessions with her. And so I had, and I really felt almost intoxicated by connecting with the other patients and hearing about their lives and what had led them here, and hearing about their suffering, and just feeling a little less alone in mine, right? Because nobody on my support team, clinicians or family or friends, had ever gone through anything like what I was going through. But here were some people who had, and so that was really great. But I don't know, there were still lots of times where I felt very invalidated, of course. And like after a few days, I started losing my train of thought, like probably a dozen times at least a day. I mean, like completely stopped, and then it would not come back to me after 5 or 10 seconds. And it was happening to my roommate too. And we would be sitting in our room some days and trying to have a conversation about who knows what. And neither of us could remember what at certain points. And he would say, "What was I talking about?" And I would be like, I'm sorry, I don't actually remember myself either. And then we would take turns doing that. I would say that like 5 minutes later. I'm sorry, I just lost it. What was I talking about? And he couldn't tell me. And I complained to one of the nurses about this, and she was like, "Well, as we get older, it happens to us, And I was like, "You don't understand. Like, this happens to me like maybe once a year, and the train comes back to me. This is happening to me like a dozen times, like she just did not.
At the old age of 35.
Yeah,
34.
yeah, exactly.
And it's funny because I have this emotion in me of like, and I sense it in you maybe that it's almost something you can look back and laugh at because it's so absurd.
Yeah.
And on a more serious level, that is absolutely tragic that honestly, the brilliant mind of a young man be so neutered and so just disrupted in its functioning by this cocktail of drugs. So anyway, yeah. So there's both sides there. There's like that's almost hilarious, but that's in a more real sense tragic that would happen.
Yeah.
And I hope people are tracking because at this point, I mean, you've mentioned I've kind of been taking notes, but there was the Zyprexa still at that point, and Wellbutrin, which was increased, and Luvox, and lithium, and Invega, and mood stabilizers. And Seroquel. It's just shocking every time.
Yeah.
And I've learned of many cases like this now, and I still feel this feeling of shock that there are people, medical professionals, who rationalize this and continue to practice like this. It is insane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard it time and time and time again, but it sounds like it still kind of shakes you up each time. Like, I can't believe this is going on a wide scale.
Exactly.
A wide scale.
And this is what I kind of think of as the web of psychiatry. And I always feel the need to give the caveat of like, shout out to the great psychiatrists who have done the work to kind of learn more than their medical training may have taught them, and who are very, very careful about these prescriptions and always have a long-term tapering plan in place. But that is the minority, is my impression. And this web of like, it's kind of like once you're in, then it's just a matter of like, well, let's switch the diagnosis, let's add this prescription, just this strange puzzle that a person doesn't even need to be on at all. So yeah. So anyway, please continue. So I hear you saying, and I appreciate you highlighting the bright spots of that inpatient experience, the psychologist, the group therapy, the connection with other patients, and then the maddening aspect of it as well.
Yes, definitely maddening. Most of the maddening moments were around the psychiatrist. The person who spends the least amount of time with you, thinks they know that they more than anybody else what's going on with you. And one day there was a conversation I had at the end of the hallway, at the very end of the unit, by a window looking out on the parking lot, with this incredible nurse. It was a pretty busy day, it seemed like, on the unit. Mid-morning, maybe, busy time on the unit, different groups going on and so on. And this nurse sat with me for like an hour as I was crying, and we talked about all kinds of very personal stuff, and my Christian upbringing, and he was a Christian, and my experience in services, and growing up in the Pentecostal kind of church. And it was a very meaningful conversation to me. And later, a day or two later, in my daily sync up with the psychiatrist, he actually admonished me for taking up that much of that nurse's time. Like, he seemed to think that once he didn't like a patient, and I know he didn't like me, and I think it's because I didn't just kind of accept everything that he would tell me. I would occasionally challenge certain things and try and clarify. I think I was respectful, but I was just, not accepting things by default. And so he kind of turned against me. And once he did, it felt like he was assuming some kind of like bad will on my part. Like I was trying to mess up the functioning of the unit and just be a rabble rouser. And it's like he was just so unable to see my suffering, and so and just, you know, in the way of like an authoritarian structure, like an authoritarian family home. It felt like he was viewing me like a child who was, an authoritarian father might view a child who was just trying to challenge him and turn others against him, and just and try and be and speak and act out of place, you know, in the structure is very much how it felt to me. It was just very invalidating. And as I kind of alluded to earlier about many of my clinicians, not just him, but several others too, at different times that I saw, when I would explain that I didn't like my old field, they would be like, well, but when you're in your kind of condition, you know, you can't just leave here and just go back home and have nothing to do. Which, okay, that's fair. But they would just, you need to, I was telling him that I wanted to help people in some way, in healthcare or in mental health care, or I didn't know yet something. And completely invalidating. I mean, we were standing out in the hallway instead of his office, and there were nurses around, and a few other people could kind of hear our conversation. And he told me and whoever was kind of half listening, like, you know, you need to get some work, and you know, you might as well do it in what you're trained in, you know, like just has no understanding of like what has caused me all this pain over the years. Just so anyway,
And if I remember correctly, he also ended up diagnosing you with borderline personality disorder.
Yes, I was about to get to that. Yes. Thank you for, yes. I was, when I was ready to leave the unit, I had kind of my exit interview, so to speak, with the psychologist that I had such a good connection with. And she had all these papers in front of her, and I really was feeling a bit better. I didn't really have a solid plan for what I was going to do when I got out, but I was like, 9 days is enough, and I feel like pretty stable, if hazy. And she handed all these different documents out to me about the medications I was on, and, you know, kind of like all the official inserts and documentation and stuff. And then she said, now, I'm required to give this one to you too, because the psychiatrist requires me to. But off the record, I want you to throw it in the trash on your way out of the building. And it was a packet on borderline personality disorder, which I actually knew very little about and still have not read very much about. But I'm very glad that she prevented me a lot of neurosis, because I knew that she knew me so much better than the psychiatrist did. And she prevented me, you know, a lot of that neurosis by like just telling me like, this is bullshit. Like, don't take this seriously. So
yeah. Wow. Well, I don't want to make you summarize the sort of turnaround and what has happened since then too quickly, but I have about 10 more minutes before having to depart my office, and I want to utilize every minute of these 10 minutes here in conversation with you still. So I tell you that because I know you would want to know and not just be cut off at the end. But do you think in the next 10 minutes you can kind of bring us up to date and talk about how things changed, the status of current drug treatment, if anything, and how you feel today?
Yes. The latter half of 2021 got even worse. I didn't know that the worst was yet to come. I felt a little better after inpatient, and then pretty quickly didn't feel so good again. My family still felt they kind of reverted. They didn't take the bipolar diagnosis that seriously, just like I didn't. And they kind of reverted back to the OCD thing. I went to 2 residential treatments, 1 month long each, which in our previous talk, we also didn't have much time to get into those. There's plenty to say about those 2, but I think the inpatient was probably more interesting, maybe. Suffice to say, those didn't. I tried a host of different medications there too. Ended up getting on Cymbalta, getting off of Luvox, eventually got off of Zyprexa. That seemed that I was only able to do that because I was now on another antipsychotic, Invega. I remained on that through the end of 2021 on monthly injections. And still on a bunch of medications, and had all kinds of different therapists and group therapies in my residential treatment, none of which seemed to help. Especially the OCD support groups at one of the residential treatments. If there was ever a confirmation that I didn't have that condition. Now I know that there are many ways people might present while being given that label of OCD, but I didn't feel it was anything to do with me when I sat for a month in daily sessions with people that really did fit a more classical description of OCD. So I left there in about October, and it was there that I came up with the plan to go to nursing school. And it just seemed like a pragmatic plan. It seemed like doable. I could take an accelerated program in 1 year. It just seemed like it made some sense on paper. And I was going to do that. And I was going to start taking prerequisites when I got out. And I got out, and the people from the residential treatment and my family were encouraging me to move out of my parents' house, which I felt well enough to do. At least I thought I did. Didn't have a job or anything yet, but I got an apartment in the same town as my parents and moved in. And it was there that I reached like a new stage. I was not crying anymore. I was not in high distress. And yet the suicidal thoughts got stronger than they ever had before. And I started looking up methods and even buying some supplies on the web. And I didn't have a date picked out, and I wasn't making real hidden preparations, but I became very, very fixated on it and felt it was what I must do. And that was at the very end of 2021. But a part of me knew that as far as the actual circumstances of my life were, how much money I had saved, how much family support I had, and my education, and all this stuff, my life wasn't really hopeless if I could just find a treatment that would work. I still held out some hope for psychedelics, even though they didn't seem to give me enduring relief, during closure, during wholeness before. But I started looking into ECT, or as those in the critical psychiatry community like to call it, electroshock. I had my skepticisms of it, and I knew about the potential for memory loss, but I thought, what do I have to lose? I mean, I'm thinking about ending it. And I started looking into it and talking to a few clinics that weren't any in my town, but I started thinking about it. And then I thought, why don't I try ketamine one more time? That was available locally. Something made me want to try that again. I tried it again. IV injections. Infusions. 6 of them is the usual course. I took 6 of them. It takes about 2 or 3 weeks. I was not even giving temporary relief during the middle of the sessions. I mean, I was literally like just awash in suicidal thoughts and hopeless thoughts during the ketamine sessions, which is kind of the way they work for people, even when they don't give enduring relief, is like you get at least an hour or 2 timeout, where you inhabit a different state of mind, where your normal mental prison is kind of dissolved. I wasn't even experiencing that. It just didn't disrupt my mind state at all. And so I became very hopeless. I was like, this isn't working, and I guess I'll try ACT. What am I going to do? I persisted at the suggestion of my dad and finished all 6, and I just came out of it all. And I still am shocked by that today. And I still see my condition through all those years as more of a spiritual sickness than a biological condition. And yet I can't, that doesn't explain how ketamine just snapped me out of it. And to be clear, I didn't have a transcendental kind of experience of being cradled by God or something like that. There wasn't any major revelation. I just suddenly came out of it. I was like, oh, it's all, the spell is over. I just couldn't believe it. I was back. And I went into the monasteries that I had wanted to go to the previous year. I spent about 4 months there, thinking I would maybe spend a year or more there. I spent about 4 months there and realized maybe sometime later in my life, I'll do this for a more extended period. But for now, I want to serve people. I want to be in the world. I want to be in the community and serve people in some way. I left. In spite of my experience at the inpatient psych unit, in spite of the psychiatrist in charge, I took a job as a psych tech there, and I worked there for about 6 months. I decided I was taking some prerequisites for nursing school during this time and making progress. And then in order to stash up some extra money before nursing school, before, not being able to work during a full-time program for a year, I decided to try taking a job in my old field. And I got one. And I left the psych unit. This was late 2022. I was there for some months. It was good at first. Seemed like it was very weird. I was like, I know this isn't the long-term plan, but I seem to be doing well and actually even caring about it, strangely, a little bit. But yet I started drinking again. And I started not liking my job after a few months. And I was very grouchy. I did not like who I was becoming. It didn't feel like me. And I was laid off along with my entire team. So it wasn't targeted towards me or my performance, but it was just structuring and restructuring in the company. And I took some time off after that and continued finishing up my nursing school prereqs. I moved, and last summer I massively improved my diet, began exercising, stuff that I had kind of made baby steps towards during the very bad times, but never felt like enough, But I really made some dramatic changes I've really made some dramatic kind of healthy living changes over the last 7 or 8 months. And I've decided right now to postpone the nursing school idea. It feels a little too directed. All of my energy into just one thing for a whole year and putting a lot of money down into a profession that I'm not sure is the right path for me yet. An idea that came to me when I was still in a very hazy medicated state. I've since gotten off all my medications. I'm not on any psychiatric meds anymore. I did not do a slow taper with any of them. I have to be honest and say that, but I know that is not the recommendation for listeners. I don't know if the ketamine somehow helped, but in early 2022, but my insurance had changed in January when I went to go start the ketamine sessions, and the new insurance company needed proof that I needed the Invega shot, and there was some delay there, and so I lapsed for a month, and suddenly realized I was feeling okay. So then I just didn't take it anymore. I remained on Cymbalta until last spring, and eventually just stopped it. I was only on it for about a year and a half. So I suspect that because I wasn't on it for like a decade or more, that it was easy and I had stopped Luvox before under medical supervision at one of the residential treatments. And it was uncomfortable for about a week, but I was able to just stop that one as well. So anyhow, I know you've got to run. I'm doing very well now. I'm working part-time at a suicide crisis line, answering the phone because of how meaningful that was to me when I was a caller for maybe a half dozen times or so in 2021. I just started pretty recently, and it could have the potential for full time. So I'm still exploring whether I might want to be involved in mental health care in some capacity, whether as a psychotherapist or who knows how. I'm still figuring out the path. I never got that revelation of here's the path. I don't have to wonder anymore. I had God or somebody lay out my path for us. It never happened to me like it did to some of James's subjects at his lectures. And it doesn't for most probably, but it's just a lifelong process of, as I've heard many middle-aged and even older adults kind of self-deprecatingly say at times, like, I'm whatever age I'm at and I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up, That pretty well describes me right now, but I'm very comfortable with it in a way I've never been. And I'm just kind of got me feeling my way through what's next. And as long as I guess I want to end on a note of like there were some relationships in my life, some friendships that have been so critical for maintaining my well-being, even since getting better from the ketamine. I don't credit the ketamine only, obviously. It's a whole bunch of things. I know how hard it is for someone who's so withdrawn and in despair and has been that way for a few years to answer text messages, to want to be in public, certainly, be around people. I know how difficult that is. I've been there for a solid year or more. And I can only say that, if you have at least one or two friends who you think, even if you've lost touch with them, who you think might be delighted to hear from you and accept you as you are now and not kind of invalidate you or judge you, that as much as you don't feel like doing that and might be anxious about how they will accept you as you are now, I would highly encourage you to try and reach out to them and get them in your life and let them know what's going on with you and let them love you, support you. So it's been so important for me over the last year, especially. A couple of people in my life who I'm thinking about. Yeah.
That's a beautiful message, and I am here to co-sign on that message. Yeah, and I just feel like that's not really typically emphasized enough. Maybe like exercise and eat well. That tends to be emphasized, and those things are very important. But these relationships, particularly with friends, where you feel like they're not obligated to be there for you like family is, and family is also crucial. But I do think friends fulfill a unique need, especially when times get hard. So I love that message. I think that's very important. And I do I am reluctant to end in a way that feels somewhat abruptly here. So I'm sorry that I have to, but I just want to communicate that number one, you have my deepest compassion, and I hope that you've been able to feel compassion exuding from me to you as you reflect on all the suffering you've experienced. It sounds so intense, and I just think it's just amazing, that in the same way that you were saying many people can't even imagine their life without alcohol, I think many people can't imagine their life without their prescriptions. And so here you are, as someone who came off of a very high number of prescriptions, and you're doing better than you were. And I think it's probably also a critical part of your kind of recipe of getting better, that you are serving others, that you have that sense of meaning and purpose. And I will also say that, you mentioned the possibility of getting into the field of mental health as a therapist or in some other role. And I would just, I'm here to fan those flames. I think you would be uniquely equipped to help many people. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for being so transparent, so open, so forthcoming about so many uncomfortable details. I think you've done us all a great service, to put this out onto the internet for all of time. And who knows, we have no idea who will listen to this and who will benefit from it. But I know for sure that people will benefit from this. So, Kent, thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for this podcast. It's been a great inspiration for me and really helped shift my perception of what I went through. And I love your open mind and your open way of listening to your guests, kind of allowing them to speak as they need and not interrupt them. And you're so cleaned and connected to your guests. And it's been wonderful being a listener of your podcast and getting so much from it.
I feel that. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Well, to the audience, I will say until our next episode, and to you, Kent, I will say until we speak again, because I trust we'll stay connected.
I hope so.
So, yeah. All right. Have a wonderful evening. I hope things continue to get better and that you feel like you continue to flourish. I'll want to hear an update on how things are going soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Nick.
You're welcome.